sorry. False alarm, folks. I'm sorry. Meeting to order the James City County Wetlands Board. Roll call, please.
Mr. Roadley.
Here.
Mr. Waltrip.
Here.
Mr. Gussman.
Here.
Mr. Apperson.
Here.
Mr. Dunn.
Here.
Any comments on minutes? Talked about. Understand approved as read. Protocol requires that I read this at the beginning of the meeting as the justification of our existence. The responsibility of this board is to carry out locally the Commonwealth policy to preserve the wetlands and to accommodate economic activity so as to prevent their desertification. We'll move on to public hearings, and at this time I'm going to recite the rules and regulations for the public hearings that we have. The outline for tonight's public hearing will be a staff presentation, followed by any questions or clarifications from the board. Then the public hearing will be opened. At that time, anybody wishing to speak may do so once called upon by the chair. All public speakers must state their name and address for the record. After everyone who wishes to speak have done so, the public hearing will be closed and discussion among the board will start. Moving on to our first case, Mr. Long, I see you're presenting it, WJPA 21-043.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Trevor Long, James City County Watershed Planner, here to present WJPA 21-0043. Mr. Matthew Roth, Roth Environmental, LLC, has applied for a wetlands permit on behalf of Mr. Ryan Lee, Westport Neighborhood Association, Inc., to install a kayak/canoe launch and a community pier on property located at 3475 Westport within the Gordon Creek watershed. The applicant is proposing to install a kayak and canoe launch and a community pier. The total length of the pier will be 592 square feet. The pier will be constructed along an existing pathway used by residents that is proposed to be upgraded for resident safety. Additionally, there will be a gangway and floating dock installed, which will traverse approximately 68 square feet of tidal wetlands. While there are tidal wetland vegetation within the premise of the site, it is not anticipated that any vegetation within the board's jurisdiction will be within the limits of disturbance for this project. However, the pier is intended for public use, and it is for this reason that this permit request must be heard by the board tonight. As published in the Virginia Register on July 11, 2005, the revised Wetland Mitigation Compensation Policy and Supplemental Guidelines, Regulation 4 VAC 20-390-10, Virginia, as a Chesapeake Bay program partner, is committed to achieve a no net loss of existing wetlands acreage and function in the signatories' regulatory programs. In order for a proposed project to be authorized to impact wetlands and compensate for the wetland loss in some prescribed manner, the following three criteria must be met. All reasonable mitigative efforts, including alternative siting, which would eliminate or minimize wetland loss or disturbance, must be incorporated in the proposal. The proposal must clearly be water dependent in nature, and the proposal must demonstrate clearly its need to be in the wetlands and its overwhelming public and private benefits. If the proposed project cannot meet one or more of the above criteria, the project must be denied or must occur in areas outside of the wetlands. Should it satisfy all three criteria, however, compensation for the wetland loss is required. The sequence of acceptable mitigation options should be as followed: on-site, off-site within the same watershed, mitigation banks in the same watershed, or a payment in lieu of fee. If compensation is required, it should be a condition of the permit. Staff has reviewed the application and finds that this project meets the three criteria outlined above, and that no tidal mitigation is proposed nor required. Staff would require that an inspection take place 1 year after the completion of this project to ensure that no invasive species are a result of the proposed construction. Staff has reviewed the above application and it recommends approval of the application as presented. Should the board wish to approve the application, staff suggests the following conditions be incorporated into its approval. The applicant must obtain all other necessary local, state, and/or federal permits as required for the project. All development activities located in the special flood hazard area shall comply with Article 6, Division 3, Floodplain Area Regulations of the James City County Zoning Ordinance and receive all required approval and permits prior to commencement of such activities. Then inspection take place 1 year after the completion of this project to ensure no invasive species are a result of the proposed construction. That this wetlands permit for this project shall expire on November 10th, 2024 if construction is not begun. And if an extension to this permit is needed, a written request shall be submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division no later than September 29th, 2024, just 6 weeks prior to the expiration date of this permit. Thank you. I will now divert your attention to a brief presentation. Again, the applicant request is to install a kayak and canoe launch and a community pier on property located at 3475 Westport within the Gordon Creek Watershed. It's at the very end of the street and the subdivision of Westport, and the current site is being used as a foot trail that leads down towards the wetlands where people are currently launching kayaks and canoes out of. Aerial photographs showing the site and the proposed project area. You can see an outline of the existing trail that comes down through the woods. The topography of the site, again, it gets flatter towards the resource and slopes upwards towards the street. The floodplain as it affects this property, and the site plan that has been submitted by the agent. In yellow, we see the proposed impervious area with the floating dock, the gangway, and the walkway. In the gray hatch marks are the limits of disturbance for the proposed project, and the blue lines near the gangway are the low water mark and high water mark for this project. A cross section of the pier showing the existing grade and the proposed construction down to the water with the high and low water marks outlined here in red. The area in green is the Wetlands Board's jurisdiction. Some site photographs. Standing at the entrance of the trail, about at the edge of what will be the constructed pier, looking out towards the resource. Standing at the high water mark and also looking out towards Gordon's Creek. And looking back up towards the trail from approximately just beyond the high water mark currently. A couple of photos of the low water mark at low tide, and a similar photo at high tide. Again, staff does recommend approval of this permit request, given that all other necessary local, state, and/or federal permits are required, that all development activities located in the special flood hazard area shall comply with floodplain area regulations of the James City County Zoning Ordinance, that a meeting take place 1 year after construction to ensure that no invasive species are a result of the proposed construction, and that this wetlands permit shall expire on November 10th, 2024, with any requests for an extension be submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division no later than September 29th, 2024, just 6 weeks prior to the expiration date of this permit. Thank you. Be happy to answer any questions the staff may have.
You ever decide whether that was wetlands or tidal water or not non-tidal?
Yes, sir. There was a tidal study that was performed. I'll let the agent talk more about it, but the creek itself is tidal, and that is on the site plan approximately where the blue lines are shown here, with the furthest being the low water mark and the farthest being the high water mark.
Question, how wide is the deck for the launch? How wide?
Mr. Waltrip, would you please speak up So the microphone picks you up, please.
How wide is the walkway deck leading down to where you put the kayaks in?
I will defer that question to the applicant to make sure that it's a correct width.
Questions? I have no problem with the project at all, the application, but I'm just curious, is the property privately owned, or is it an association lot, or who owns the property that this is being built on?
This property is owned by the homeowners association.
Thank you. No questions at this time. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
We will now open the public hearing. If anyone wishes to speak to this project, please come up and identify yourself.
Good evening, Mr. Apperson and members of the board. I'm Matthew Roth, president of Roth Environmental, 700 Prescott Circle, Newport News, Virginia. The decking will be 5 feet wide. Since our last hearing, where we went back and did some additional study on the tidal, non-tidal nature of the creek, I had visited the site 3 times prior to that hearing, and apparently hit it at high tide or very near every time I was out there. The applicant agreed to do a tidal study. We went out and installed some monitoring posts, and we found that the tide range was roughly 2 feet. So it's tidal, not a question about it. The plan actually has been modified just a little bit based on that tidal study, because we actually found the limits of mean low water, which were here. That's right here. The previous plan, the floating portion of the structure would have sat right across that mean low water mark, so it may not have floated at low tide. So we've extended the decking roughly 14 feet. Actually, it is 14 feet out, so that we are across that mean low water mark. So the floating portion of the pier will always be floating and not pose a safety concern if it were to slope by sitting on the bottom. As Mr. Long said, we are extending this pier down an existing pathway that the residents are using. There will be no clearing of trees as part of the proposed project. There may be some trimming of a few wax myrtle bushes, but that's all they're going to need to do. As far as the parameters for siting the pier, obviously using the existing trail, it's one of the narrowest parts of the wetlands in this wetland system, and there's no need to clear forest for the new trail. We looked at other areas to install the pier to the north. That was the only other area which the path accesses without having to do additional clearing through the RPA buffer. And there are wider wetland impacts to the south. The north is much steeper, and it's not very conducive to installing a pier and launching watercraft from that area. We'd have to build some stairs and things like that. The pier will be a couple feet, 2 feet off the substrate. We're building it low for safety. The floating portion of the gangway will be PVC and galvanized metal. And per the last hearing, there were some questions on how they were going to actually get out to install the piles. I talked to the contractor, and he said that he can't get a barge back up in there that far. It's just not deep enough for him to do that. So he's got to access it traversing out. He said he can't build it as he goes, like on top of the piles in the pier, just to the narrowness of the structure. And he said his other option would have been to build alongside of it, which he said would have required more clearing. So his proposal is to use the timber mats to go out to the end and then work his way back. And in doing so, he's been instructed to avoid cypress knees. And he said he can definitely work around those. I know that was another concern of the board. He also agreed that if there are cypress knees in the location where the piles are supposed to be, he can adjust those as needed to avoid the cypress knees. He was actually had a rather comical comment with that. Was he didn't want to, he said the last time he had to install piles and he had to fight cypress knees, he didn't have a piece of equipment big enough because they were just so strong. So he's very willing to avoid the cypress knees wherever he can. And aside from that, the area that we are extending across the wetlands, we do have the mudflat area, which is between the high and low water mark. The area back landward of the high water mark, that's all herbaceous vegetation. It's a very shaded system in there, And once the pier's installed, the herbaceous stuff's going to come right back. It's used to growing in that shaded system, so we see no vegetative impacts to those wetlands. And then finally, Mr. Long stated that the invasive species study, I know that was brought up at the last hearing, and we're more than happy that the staff can do an inspection 1 year out, and if there's any invasive species, the applicant has agreed to take action in the project area and control that. I'm happy to answer any questions if you have any.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Anyone else wish to speak, please come forward. I don't see anyone else, so we'll close the public hearing. Anyone want to begin?
Mr. Chairman, it appears that we've solved the riddle of whether it's tidal or non-tidal, so we have the authority to regulate, and I have no issue with the project.
Waltrip, anything?
The main thing is they extended the pier out far enough that it'll float all the time. That's a good thing, because once those floats get all out of whack and everything, then you got a mess on your hands. So that was a good move there. So.
Anyone wish to make a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I move to adopt the resolution to grant the permit for Wetlands Board Case WJPA 21-0043.
Mr. Wilson?
We have a motion to adopt the resolution. Mr. Roadley,
Yes.
Mr. Waltrip,
Yes.
Mr. Gussman,
Yes.
Mr. Dunn,
Yes.
Mr. Apperson.
Yes. Motion's carried. Thank you. Thank you all. Moving on to board considerations for the 202 calendar. We've had that delivered to us. Does anyone wish to speak to that? Any problem with the calendar?
Looks fine.
Mr. Chair, we want to give the board the option before you adopt the 2022 calendar to potentially move the starting date, or I'm sorry, the starting time of the meeting from 5 o'clock to a different time should the board choose to do so.
Okay, that's fine. Anybody want to speak to that? Change the time from 5? I think that's where he's coming from. Up or down, if you have any feelings about it? I personally, it doesn't make a bit of difference to me, one way or the other.
Yeah,
Whatever's
I'm
best.
benefiting from COVID right now, working from home, but once I go back to work, I think 4 o'clock would be tough for me.
Is the change to make it better for the citizens to come here? Is that why we're doing this? Something for the, improve the structure of the meeting? Or why did you ask to change?
We just wanted to give the board the option to change should they
Okay.
do so.
So you don't have any
Other
requests or
boards in the
anything from
county,
anybody outside?
other boards in the county start at different times. The Board of Supervisors starts at 1 o'clock, one meeting of the month, and 5 o'clock on the second meeting of the month. Planning Commission starts at 7. There's a Stormwater Program Advisory Committee that starts at 4 o'clock. So we just wanted to give the board the option to potentially move the starting time.
I think it's a good idea to stay on a set time. That way you can plan your work. When you jump around a lot, somebody's going to miss it.
Can we just have an informal agreement to leave it at 5 o'clock, or do we need a motion, or is everyone in agreement to leave it at 5? If
That's
not,
fine with
is that
me.
all right with you? Okay, it's 5 o'clock it is, then, looks like Mr. Waltrip. Second thing will be the election of officers. And I suppose.
Chairman, are you willing to serve in your capacity again?
I was going to offer the job to anyone that would volunteer for it. It looked like you already ahead of me there, but I would like to ask if anyone would like to volunteer for this. I'll be glad to nominate you. Wow. That settled that, didn't it? Yes, sir, I would consider it an honor to serve as chairman of your committee. Yes, sir.
So moved.
And on that, we need to have a vice chair. And I think Mr. Gussman, are you the vice chair?
No,
No?
is Mr. Dunn the vice chair?
I can't remember. I really don't know.
Yeah, I might
I'm
Mr. Dunn
sorry.
is vice chair.
Sorry, Mr. Would you, I would like to ask you if you would consider accepting that nomination again, sir.
I'd be honored to continue the capacity as vice chair. Thank you, sir.
All right,
So moved.
so moved. And I think the secretary's pretty well locked in. We don't have any, what are you pointing to? Mr. Long this time? Okay. Mr. Long, it looks like you've got a new job here. You're going to be our secretary, I understand. Anyone have any comments on that? Do we need a vote on that, Mr. Wilson?
Yes, sir.
I make a motion
So
that
we need to vote for, and we can vote for all three at the same time.
make
Mr.
a motion that
Apperson
we
is
appoint
chair,
Mr. Long.
Mr.
Excuse me,
Dunn.
I'm sorry. I thought you'd finished. Go ahead, sir,
M-
please.
M- Mr. Apperson is chair, Mr. Dunn is vice chair, and Mr. Long is secretary.
That sounds good. The motion?
Okay. I make a motion along those lines.
I actually need another roll call vote on that, Mr. Wilson?
Mr. Roadley,
Yes.
Mr. Waltrip,
Yes.
Mr. Gusman,
Yes.
Mr. Dunn,
Yes.
Mr. Apperson.
Yes.
And Mr. Chair, we will need a formal vote on the 2022 calendar.
Okay. All right. Does anyone have any additions? or
Move that we
corrections?
adopt the 2022 calendar as
Very good.
proposed.
Will you call on that, sir? Call the roll, please.
Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Waltrip?
Yes.
Mr. Gusman?
Yes.
Mr. Dunn?
Yes.
Mr. Apperson?
Yes, yes.
Thank you.
Thank you. Special privileges. Anyone have anything they wish to bring up? Would anyone like to motion to adjourn? Motion to adjourn.
So moved.
We are adjourned.
I'd like to call to order the November 10th meeting of the James City County Chesapeake Bay Board. The responsibility of this board is to carry out locally the Commonwealth policy to protect against and minimize pollution and deposition of sediment in wetland streams and lakes in James City County, which are tributaries of the Chesapeake Bay. Mr. Wilson, can we have a roll call, please?
Mr. Roadley?
Here.
Mr. Waltrip?
Here.
Mr. Apperson?
Here.
Mr. Dunn?
Here.
Mr. Gusman?
Here. Are there any additions, deletions, changes to the minutes? Okay, the minutes stand approved. The outline for tonight's public hearing will be a staff presentation followed by questions or clarifications from the board. Then the public hearing will be opened. At that time, anybody wishing to speak may do so once called upon by the chair. All public speakers must state their name and address for the record. After everyone wishing to speak have done so, the public hearing will be closed and discussion among the board will start. First case is CBPA 21-0130, 115 Heathery. Mr. Long?
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Trevor Long, James City County Watershed Planner. Mr. Chase Grogg of Land Tech Resources has requested a deferral of this application for exception to the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance while the site plan is finalized for this project. Staff concurs with this request. As this case has been a public notice, staff recommends that the public hearing be opened and stay open until the December meeting, at which time the case will be heard.
Okay. Any questions about that? Okay. At this time, I'd like to open the public hearing. Has anyone come here tonight who would like to speak on this? The public hearing is open. Okay. No one appears to wish to speak to it. I'll leave the public hearing open. And do we need a motion to defer?
No, sir.
Okay. All right. Then let's move on to our next case. Next case is CBPA 21-0160, 2521 Goodrich Durfee.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair, members of the board. Trevor Long, James City County Watershed Planner, here represents CBPA-21-0160. Mr. Ryan Newsom, Delightful Gardens Landscape Company, has applied for a Chesapeake Bay exception on behalf of Mary Fox trustee for encroachments into the RPA buffer for the replacement and expansion of a pool deck and the expansion of a house deck on property located at 2521 Goodrich Durfee with the vineyards at Jockey's Neck subdivision and the College Creek Watershed. Parcel was platted in 1991 prior to the changes in the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance in 2004, which affect this property. Total lot size of this property is 1.73 acres, of which 49% is located within the RPA. The majority of the rear of the property is located within this RPA. A portion of the house, a pool, and a deck currently exists within the RPA on site. These additions were constructed prior to the changes in the Chesapeake Bay Ordinance that affected this property in 2004. The applicant is proposing to replace and expand the existing pool deck, equating to approximately 489 square feet of impacts to the landward 50-foot RPA and 252 square feet of impacts to the seaward 50-foot RPA. Additionally, the applicant is proposing to construct a mid-level deck and stairs behind the existing deck to the rear of the house, equating to approximately 350 square feet of impacts to the seaward 50-foot RPA. The proposed impacts of this project are to take place on existing turf areas. Total impacts associated with the proposed improvements equates to 1,091 square feet of impervious impacts to the RPA. Additionally, there is an existing turf area between the proposed pool and the existing deck. Staff would require this area to remain vegetated. Required mitigation for this amount of impervious impacts to the RPA equals 3 planting units, which is 3 canopy trees, 6 understory trees, and 9 shrubs. The applicants have submitted a mitigation plan that exceeds this, therefore fulfilling county requirements. The applicants are also proposing to construct an infiltration BMP to capture runoff from the proposed pool expansion and deck expansion, which plan has been submitted to the county for review at this time. Staff has evaluated the application and exception request for the replacement and expansion of a pool and house deck. This application meets the ordinance conditions in sections 23-11 and 23-14 and should be heard by the board because construction of a deck is considered accessory in nature. The board may grant exceptions to section 23-7 if the application meets the following 5 conditions. The exception request is the minimum necessary to afford relief. Granting the exception will not confer upon the applicants any special privileges denied by Chapter 23, Chesapeake Bay Preservation of the James City County Code to other property owners similarly situated in the vicinity. The exception request will be in harmony with the purpose and intent of Chapter 23 of the James City County Code and is not of substantial detriment to water quality. The exception request is not based on conditions or circumstances that are self-created or self-imposed, nor does the request arise from conditions or circumstances either permitted or non-conforming that are related to adjacent parcels, and that reasonable and appropriate conditions are imposed which will prevent the exception request from causing a degradation of water quality. Staff has reviewed the application and exception request and has determined that impacts associated with the proposal to be major for the proposed development. Staff does recommend approval for this exception request, and if the board wishes to approve this request, staff recommends the following conditions be incorporated into its approval. The applicant must obtain all other necessary federal, state, and/or local permits as required for the project, including a building permit if necessary. That a surety of $2,000 be submitted in a form acceptable to the James City County Attorney's Office to guarantee the mitigation plantings and BMP installation. This exception request approval shall become null and void if construction is not begun by November 10th, 2022, and that written requests for an extension to this exception shall be submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division no later than September 29th, 2022, just 6 weeks prior to the expiration date of this exception request. Thank you. I'll now divert your attention to the screen for a brief presentation. Again, the applicant's request is to replace and expand a pool deck and expand a house deck on property located at 2521 Goodrich Durfee, outlined here in blue in the vicinity map, with the purple divide being the Watershed division. An aerial photograph from 2005 showing the current house and the pool that exists on property currently. Again, these encroachments to the RPA were constructed prior to the changes in the ordinance which enacted the RPA onto this lot. And an aerial photograph from 2019 showing the current existing conditions of the property. The topography on the lot is fairly flat. It is similar to a peninsula lot. Water comes up on multiple sides, and it does slope downwards towards the water and is flatter towards the existing site conditions. The resource protection area as it affects this lot, coming up about halfway through the house and driveway. and the site plan that's been submitted to staff with the 100-foot resource protection area approximately coming through the house and existing conditions here. The 50-foot resource protection area offset here. And the proposed pool deck expansion here in yellow, the existing deck just within this expansion. There is an existing fence that encompasses this area, which is the black line that surrounds it. The proposed deck expansion is currently situated here with the existing deck just beyond it. And the proposed infiltration trench being used as mitigation, capturing the majority of the runoff from the proposed impervious areas on both of the pool deck and the mid-level deck here. Some site photographs. The orange stakes here, here, and here show the approximate location for the mid-level deck. Looking backwards towards the existing deck, again, the proposed expansion of the mid-level deck. And the area just adjacent to the existing pool deck, which is beginning to become dilapidated and does need to be replaced. Essentially, the pool deck will expand outwards towards the currently existing fence on both sides. Staff does recommend approval of this application and exception request, given that all other necessary local, state, and/or federal permits are required. This would include a building permit if necessary, and that a surety of $2,000 to guarantee the plantings and BMP installation is submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division. And this exception request approval shall become null and void if construction is not begun by November 10th, 2022, with any written request for an extension submitted no later than September 29th, 2022, which is 6 weeks prior to the expiration date of this permit. Thank you very much, and I would be happy to answer any questions the board may have at this time.
Any questions for Mr. Long?
Anything else, sir?
I'd like, when the applicant comes up, I'd like to ask some questions about how the infiltration trench will be constructed, but I'll wait till then.
Certainly. Thank you.
All right. At this time, I'd like to open the public hearing. Would the applicant like to address the board?
Good evening. Ryan Newsom with Delightful Garden, 7242 Merrimack Trail. Yes, I'd like to just come up to answer any questions at this time.
Okay. Can you explain to us how the infiltration basin will be constructed? How's that going to work?
Well, I've got a detail from the county, so it looks to me like we would dig a trench, put in a layer of filter fabric, and use some large aggregate, like a number 3 driveway stone. Mm-hmm. And then, so it's going to be 18 inches by 18 inches. And then have a perforated pipe that runs down through there with several catch basins. And then enclose all the gravel with the cloth, and then have some topsoil. So it just basically acts as a filter for the water coming down from the pool area and the deck, and just gives it a place to capture it before it reaches the water.
There's no pipe that runs out from it, though.
I don't believe so. I believe the purpose is just to capture that water and allow it to soak down into the ground. That's my understanding.
I don't know if you can answer this. Staff may have to help you out. Do you have to test the soils? You know, what if it's solid clay underneath there? Is that going to, would that interfere with it?
I would imagine it would take longer for it to penetrate, but yeah, I might have to ask.
Trevor, can you answer that, or Mike?
Yes, sir, Mr. Gussman. We would require a soil test, perk test, if you will, and the ultimate design may require an underdrain system to go down to the lake, so we're not creating a bathtub.
Okay. Do you have any idea? Is it any clay? Is it a heavy clay? Do you have any idea yet, or you don't know?
Most of Williamsburg seems to be a heavy clay, so it wouldn't surprise me. This would be the first time that we've constructed one of these, so Yeah, we'll definitely reach out to Trevor and Mike and make sure we do it correctly.
What, I guess this question is for the staff. What happens if you can't put one in? What happens then?
If the soils are such that it's not it doesn't infiltrate, it would still be a filtering device for pollutant removal, and we would still want to see the trench installed with the appropriate underdrain.
Okay, so you install it with an underdrain, and there will be something that you'll be able to approve. Okay.
Does it normally those drains have a outfall somewhere in it where it reaches a capacity and then it filters out to the lake through that? Is it what you're talking about, or completely containing it in this infiltration, this ditch that you're talking about?
Yes, that would make sense to have an outfall.
Now, the ones I've ever been associated with do have an outfall with your stone and filter in it where if it reaches a certain capacity, then it will leach out, but it's filtered as it goes.
Okay. Yeah,
I
well,
don't know if that's in the plan, but it's the way I've always seen them done.
Mr. Waltrip, in my experience, what you're talking about would be on a commercial type application. The intent for this infiltration trench is not to have it designed to such a high standard, but merely to infiltrate the additional runoff that's coming from this project.
If you have any questions while you're building this, reach out to the staff.
yeah, definitely. I always
Okay.
contact Trevor when I have any questions.
Okay. All right. Any other questions for the applicant?
Questions?
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Anybody else like to speak on this issue? Okay, at this time, I'll close the public hearing. Discussion from the board.
Mr. Chairman, we visited the site, both of us, and the area of disturbance is currently already disturbed with fescue, and so there's going to be no additional tree clearing within the RPA, and the encroachment is, for all intents and purposes, already there, with the exception of the elevated deck. I think the addition of an infiltration trench will serve to help improve water quality. I would encourage the applicant to look for additional plantings waterward of the infiltration trench as you get down to the dock. That area looks like it could use some, it looks like the dock may need maintenance, and maybe opportunities for strategic planting there that would help expand the buffer. Just a suggestion.
That's an excellent idea. I had sort of had some concerns about the way the plantings are. Can the staff review the plantings, with the applicant? A lot of these plantings are just going to rip out native vegetation to put in plantings. I'd rather see them, maybe moved over towards the dock area. They would make more sense over there. So revisit the plantings, look real closely. It just doesn't make sense to put the trees where there's already existing native vegetation, ripping it out and, and replanting it.
Yes, sir, we will certainly work with the applicant to look at their mitigation plan.
With an eye to maintaining the view shed. Yeah.
Any other comments from the board? Okay. Would someone like to make a motion?
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to adopt the resolution to grant the exception for Chesapeake Bay Board case CBPA 21-0160 at 2521 Goodrich Durfee.
So we have a motion to adopt the resolution. Mr. Roadley,
Yes.
Mr. Waltrip, Mr. Apperson,
Yes.
Mr. Dunn,
Yes.
Mr. Gussman.
Yes. Okay, our next case is CBPA 21-0161 1592 Harbor Road.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Robin Benedict, James City County Watershed Planner. Mr. Ryan Newsom, Delightful Gardens Landscape Company, has applied for a Chesapeake Bay exception on behalf of CSO Revocable Trust for encroachments into the RPA buffer for the installation of artificial turf on property located at 1592 Harbor Road within the Governor's Land subdivision in the James River watershed. The parcel was platted in 1994 after the adoption of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance in 1990. The total lot size of this property is 0.3 acres, of which 60% is located within the RPA. The applicant is proposing to install artificial turf to the rear of the existing house, equating to approximately 1,000 square feet of impacts in the seaward 50-foot RPA. This project will also encroach on conservation easement located behind the house. Required mitigation of this amount of impervious impacts to the RPA equals the planting of 2 canopy trees, 4 understory trees, and 12 shrubs. Staff has evaluated the application and exception request for the installation of artificial turf. This application meets the ordinance conditions in sections 23-11 and 23-14 and should be heard by the board because the installation of artificial turf is considered accessory in nature and the filter media constructed underneath the turf is a compacted gravel. The board may grant exceptions to section 23-7 if the application meets the following 5 conditions. The exception request is the minimum necessary to afford relief. Granting the exception will not confer upon the applicant any special privileges denied by Chapter 23, Chesapeake Bay Preservation of the James City County Code to other property owners similarly situated in the vicinity. The exception request will be in harmony with the purpose and intent of Chapter 23 of the James City County Code and is not of substantial detriment to water quality. The exception request is not based on conditions or circumstances that are self-created or self-imposed, nor does the request arise from conditions or circumstances either permitted or non-conforming that are related to adjacent parcels, and reasonable and appropriate conditions are imposed which will prevent the exception request from causing a degradation of water quality. Staff has reviewed the application and exception request and has determined the impacts associated with the proposal to be moderate for the proposed development. Staff recommends approval for this exception request, and if the board wishes to approve this request, staff recommends the following conditions be incorporated into the approval. The applicant must obtain all other necessary federal, state, and local permits as required for the project and written approval from the Governor's Land Foundation. The submittal of a mitigation plan equating to 2 canopy trees, 4 understory trees, and 12 shrubs be submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division prior to project start. A surety of $1,000 be submitted in a form acceptable to the James City County Attorney's Office to guarantee the mitigation plantings. This exception request approval shall become null and void if construction has not begun by November 10th, 2022, and written requests for an extension to an exception shall be submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division no later than September 29th, 2022, which is 6 weeks prior to the expiration date. Now I'll turn your attention to the screen for a short presentation. Again, this is CBPA 21-0166 for 1592 Harbor Road, and it is for the installation of artificial turf. Here, you can barely see it, but right at where my pointer is the subject parcel. Again, this is in the Governor's Land subdivision, and the purple is showing the James River watershed. Here's the project topography at the site, which is fairly flat, just barely sloping down towards the water. The resource protection area as it lays on this site, which it ends right about here in the middle of the house. The floodplain as it affects this site. Here is the submitted site plan showing the 100-foot resource protection area and the proposed artificial turf shown in green across the entirety of their backyard. Here's a cross-section of the proposed artificial turf showing the drainage rock or compacted gravel as the underlayer, and then the artificial turf up top. Existing conditions at the site. some stakes showing that the artificial turf will go all the way up to the house itself, and again, all the way to the side of the yard, covering the entirety of the backyard that is within the gated area. Again, staff recommends approval under these conditions. The applicant gets all other necessary local, state, and federal permits, as well as written approval from the Governor's Land Foundation. Mitigation plan consisting of 2 canopy trees, 4 understory trees, and 12 shrubs be submitted. A surety of $1,000 to guarantee plantings be submitted. And this exception request approval shall become null and void if construction has not begun by November 10th, 2022, and any written request for an extension submitted no later than September 29th, 2022, which is 6 weeks prior to the expiration deadline. Thank you, and I'll take any questions that you all might have.
Can you go back to the diagram? I want to see, where are they going to put in the artificial turf, and where would the plantings be?
On this site plan, here is the porch that they have on the house.
Okay.
And then they have an existing fence that goes right back here. So the area that is green on here is going to be the artificial turf.
Uh-huh.
Everything left after the fence is going to remain as is.
I want to make sure, we're talking about plastic, right? This plastic fake grass, right?
Artificial turf,
Okay,
artificial
okay,
grass,
I
yes.
just want to make sure I understand that. All right.
Could you,
Yep.
could you go back to the slides where you've got the circular, looks like stepstones in it?
Sir.
The reason that there's no grass there is because there's not enough shade to grow grass now? Is that why they want to put the artificial turf in? I can see that it's something should be, you can't walk across it there, it just looks like it's bare ground. And there's a reason being that the trees are shading it so much that you can't grow grass?
I cannot
I'm just
speak.
curious because I can understand that the artificial turf would be a good substitute for the condition that they have here now, so.
I can't speak to whether it's the trees and the shade conditions. Perhaps the contractor may be able to answer that better than I can.
Thank you.
Mr. Wilson, this is the first time we've ever had artificial turf, isn't it? Come before us?
It's the first time for the board. It's not the first time in the county.
Oh, okay.
I have seen, I'm aware of 2 other installations in other subdivisions for artificial turf. But this is the first one coming before the board.
I'll just make one comment on it, and that is that for the family, they can get rid of their lawnmower.
Yeah, I
Cutting
guess so.
green.
Mr. Chairman, a question on the conservation easement that was referenced. Could you remind me of the particulars in this? I believe it surrounds the harbor at Governor's Land, that conservation area?
Yes, the conservation as it lays on this site, it starts right beyond the porch and then goes back towards the water. So none of their existing house is within the conservation easement.
But the artificial turf is in the conservation easement.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Roadley, if I may expand upon
Please.
Ms. Benedict's answer. The conservation easement is 50 feet in width, and it does go right up to the back of these houses within Governor's Land Marina. The way the marina was designed, the first 35 feet past the bulkhead is sloping. And then the top 15 feet of that conservation, if you will, there is a slight berm to capture any runoff from the structure and take it in pipes to the opposite side of Harbor Road into a BMP system. So the what I'm saying is the first 15 feet where this artificial turf would be placed, all that drainage is being captured and taken to a BMP across the street.
That's
And
kind
that
of an
is,
important detail. Thank you.
that is true for all of the marina.
Thank you.
What's the life expectancy of the artificial turf in general? Anybody know?
I would defer that question to the applicant.
I know nothing about artificial turf, but water infiltration, I presume, is
We, when this application first came before staff, we discussed it and to try and figure out how to handle it. Since it was the first time we had seen an application like this, we are treating this, regardless of the surface treatment, we are treating this as a patio, 100% impervious. The fact that it's called artificial turf, to me, doesn't matter whether it's artificial turf or bluestone pavers or something to that effect. It's 100% impervious because of the way it's going to be constructed with compacted subbase.
if we treat it as impervious, does that change the conservation easement? Like,
No, the conservation easement question is outside the purview of the Chesapeake Bay Board, and would fall under stormwater's purview. We have historically in the marina allowed impervious cover to happen in that first 15 feet off of the house, whether it's a deck or a patio, basically inside the fenced area, if that we saw in the picture. That fence location was where this slight drainage berm is located that I discussed previously. This conservation easement was done in, I believe, 1994. We have learned a great deal on what to do and what not to do in terms of conservation easements on private properties. To hold it to the strictest interpretation of the easement, those backyards are unusable. So staff has historically granted some encroachments into that conservation easement in that first 15 feet. The remaining 35 feet of that easement is inviolate. We don't allow any impervious cover other than the approved steps or path access down to the bulkhead and the docks that are within the marina. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions for staff? Thanks. Let me open the public hearing at this time. Would the applicant like to come forward and address the board?
Yes, Ryan Newsom, Delightful Garden, 7242 Merrimack Trail. Just to touch on a few of those questions. Yes, there is a large willow oak tree right in the center there. And so that's the reason why there's just nothing growing back there, just the roots and the shade from that tree. The owner, they have a young child, so they want to have an area there. They've fenced it in, and they want to create an area for their child to be able to go out and play and stay out of the mud. So it seemed like the artificial turf was a good solution.
Mr. Newsom, would you state your name and address again for the record, please?
Oh, yes, Ryan Newsom, 7242 Merrimack Trail, Williamsburg, Virginia, 23185.
Any questions for Mr. Newsom?
Do you have experience with the life expectancy of AstroTurf?
I'm not 100% sure, but I want to say at least 10 to 15 years.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Would anyone else like to speak on this? This time I'll close the public hearing and open it up to discussion from the board. I have a lot of trouble, approving fake grass in artificial turf, within the RPA. It just sort of goes, it seems to me that goes against the spirit of the Chesapeake Bay Act. But then, as Mr. Wilson said, the staff is treating it as an impervious surface. Have we approved, I can't remember, have we approved other patios and impervious surfaces in that area?
Yes, there have been other patios and decks that have been approved within the marina within that first 15 feet.
Within the first 15 feet.
Last time we were there.
Yeah, I remember going out there a while ago. So the question is, if this would come to us and it was a deck in the first 15 feet, and we've approved them in the past, how will we treat it?
Well, a deciding factor may be that this area within that 15 feet is being treated in a stormwater management basin. So it is being treated for water quality.
One thing about it, in the next 15 years, we'll find out whether it works. So, you don't know until you try it, and if this is one of the first ones, you really don't know.
From a practical standpoint, I think that the artificial turf would be better than the mud that they have there now. That's the position I'm looking at. That's the only place I'm coming from.
But, Mr. Apperson, but then you think, there must be some kind of vegetation they could plant under the tree, or is it?
Actually, I would think mulch would be better than vegetation, but I don't want to, I don't have any right to tell them what to do with their, however they want to fix it. But if it was mine, I would mulch it, but it's not mine, and they're paying, they made an application for what they want.
So, we're not really ripping out a lot of vegetation.
I can see.
Same as putting in a patio, okay. Here's a question. Will putting in the artificial turf, will that have any impact on the tree? Will that prevent the tree, the tree from getting,
Willow oaks can essentially withstand asphalt all the way around them. It's really remarkable, the fact that to answer your point blank, no, and I can take and show you examples here in town where I think you'll agree with me.
Okay.
I never thought about that, but actually, no, I don't think it'll affect the willow oak at all. Maybe you can speak to that if you want to.
No.
You've seen how they can.
You're the forester.
They can, but they can survive. Matter of fact, they can actually lift the asphalt up and keep growing.
okay, so it's not gonna kill the tree?
No, it's not at all, not at all.
Okay. Okay. Any other comments from the board? I never thought I'd vote for AstroTurf in an RPA, but okay. Does someone want to make a motion on this?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion that we vote to adopt BPA 2-21-0016 1594 Harbor Road, artificial turf installation.
Okay, a motion to adopt a resolution to grant the exception for CBPA 21-0166. Can we have a roll call?
Certainly, there's a motion to adopt. Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Waltrip?
Yes.
Mr. Apperson?
Yes.
Mr. Dunn?
No.
Mr. Gussman?
Yes. Okay. Next case, CBPA 21-0169.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the board. Robin Benedict, James City County Watershed Planner. Mr. Chase Grogg has applied for a Chesapeake Bay exception on behalf of Mr. Zenon Sikorsky for encroachments into the RPA buffer for the construction of a single-family residence, patio, and fire pit on property located at 221 Bircher Court within the Kingsmill subdivision and the Skiffs Creek watershed. The parcel was platted in 1989 prior to the adoption of the Chesapeake Bay Preservation Ordinance in 1990. The total lot size of this property is 0.81 acres, of which 76% is located within the RPA. The applicant is proposing to construct a house with a patio and fire pit equating to approximately 1,400 square feet of impacts in the landward 50-foot RPA. Required mitigation of this amount of impervious impacts to the RPA equals the planting of 3 canopy trees, 6 understory trees, and 19 shrubs. The applicant has proposed the plantings of 4 canopy trees, 8 understory trees, and 12 shrubs, therefore exceeding county mitigation requirements. Staff has evaluated the application and exception request for the construction of a single-family dwelling. This application meets the ordinance conditions in sections 23-11 and 23-14 and should be heard by the board because the construction of a patio and fire pit are considered accessory in nature. The board may grant exceptions to section 23-7 if the application meets the following 5 conditions. The exception request is the minimum necessary to afford relief. Granting the exception will not confer upon the applicants any special privileges denied by Chapter 23, Chesapeake Bay Preservation of the James City County Code to other property owners similarly situated in the vicinity. The exception request will be in harmony with the purpose and intent of Chapter 23 of the James City County Code and is not of substantial detriment to water quality. The exception request is not based on conditions or circumstances that are self-created or self-imposed, nor does the request arise from conditions or circumstances either permitted or non-conforming that are related to adjacent parcels, and reasonable and appropriate conditions are imposed which will prevent the exception request from causing a degradation of water quality. Staff has reviewed the application and exception request and has determined the impacts associated with the proposal to be moderate for the proposed development. Staff recommends approval for this exception request, and if the board wishes to approve this request, staff recommends the following conditions be incorporated into the approval. The applicant must obtain all other necessary federal, state, and local permits as required for the project, including a building permit if necessary. The planting of 4 canopy trees, 8 understory trees, and 12 shrubs should be completed. A surety of $2,000 be submitted in a form acceptable to the James City County Attorney's Office to guarantee the mitigation plantings prior to issuance of the building permit. And this exception request approval shall become null and void if construction is not begun by November 10th, 2022, with a written request for an extension to an exception submitted to the Stormwater and Resource Protection Division no later than September 29th, 2022, which is 6 weeks prior to the expiration date. I'll turn your attention to the screen for a short presentation. Again, this is CBPA 21-0169 at 221 Bircher Court for the construction of a single-family residence with a patio and a fire pit. Here you can see the parcel outlined in blue. Again, this is in the Kingsmill subdivision and Skiffs Creek watershed. The project location. Topography at the site. It does have a great slope at the back of the site, but there will be no grading associated with this project. The floodplain as it affects this site. The resource protection area shown in green, encompassing a good bit of this. The submitted site plan showing the 100-foot resource protection area and the 50-foot resource protection area in red, as well as the proposed residence and the proposed encroachments in yellow. So part of the house, the patio, and then the fire pit are all within the RPA. Here, looking towards what would be the front of the house, this would be the front corner at this stake, And back here is a corner that would be within the RPA. Looking from the side of the house, 2 more stakes within the corner that's inside of the RPA. Looking back towards the proposed patio and fire pit, and another angle looking straight on towards that patio. And then from the back of the site, looking forward, the current conditions. Again, staff recommends approval under these conditions. The applicant obtain all other necessary local, state, and federal permits. A mitigation plan consisting of 4 canopy trees, 8 understory trees, and 12 shrubs be submitted. A surety of $2,000 to guarantee plantings be submitted. And this exception request approval shall become null and void if construction has not begun by November 10th, 2022, with written requests for an extension submitted no later than September 29th, 2022, which is 6 weeks prior to the expiration deadline. Thank you, and if you have any questions, I'll answer them at this time.
Any questions for staff?
Mr. Chairman, just to be clear, we're voting on both the house, the patio, and the encroachment for the fire pit area?
Yes, but I apologize.
Mr. Rodley, the house encroachments are technically administrative. However, because the patio and the fire pit are accessory structures, we brought the entirety of the project and their encroachments to the board as part of it. The total impervious area does include the impacts from the house as well, and the mitigation plan does reflect those encroachments. But the reason this is before the board is the patio and the fire pit.
Excuse me, I'm sorry.
Would the house have been approved administratively?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
There's no bulkheads. It's all going to be on the level ground up on top of the hill there, right?
Correct, there are no bulkheads.
Has the house been positioned such on the lot that it is as far streetward as it can go without violating any of the required setbacks?
I do believe there was discussion regarding the position of the house to meet both the setbacks and stay as far out of the RPA as possible.
I got a question. These ponds, Wareham Pond, and the different ones in there built for bush, we're talking about flooding. Aren't those ponds built so they have an overflow, so when they get to a certain height that it doesn't flood everything, it just overflows into the James River? Or do they not have this capability to maintain the level when they have a lot of rain? Or do you know?
I don't have any prior knowledge to that, but if other staff would like to speak to it.
Mr. Waltrip, Wareham's Pond does, in a 100-year flood event, it does have the necessary protections in place to convey that flood event down to the James River. If we were to get a 100-year storm event, the flood plain from Wareham's Pond would affect this property, but only at the toe of the slope. It would not affect any of the structures being proposed. Because there is a regulated floodplain on this property, we wanted to show that in the presentation to just have the board fully informed of that fact.
That answered my question on that. Thank you.
Any other questions for staff? Thank you.
Thank you.
At this time, I'd like to open the public hearing. Would the applicant or anyone like to come and address the board?
Gentlemen, I like to say I live up in the Fredericksburg area. I've never been to anything like this. and I-
Dion, would you please
Name and address.
sorry.
name and address for the record, please?
My name is Zenon Sikorsky, and my address for this is 221 Bircher Court, Williamsburg, Virginia, 23185, I believe. You can just call me Z. It's a lot easier with a name like Zenon. And I'd just like to say I've actually enjoyed tonight. It's actually been quite interesting. I don't really have any questions. This is all new to me, but if you have any questions about what I'm doing or anything or what we've worked with, please ask. I know it's significantly less if you were on the board in the prior years from what was entertained and approved in the past for the property, and basically just building a house with a patio and a fire pit.
Mr. Chairman, I can comment that I appreciate you putting it all on the table at one time instead of piecemealing it, so it gives us a complete picture. What Mr. Apperson was referring to with retaining walls is, in Kingsmill, we often see structures built close to edge of slope, causing instability after rainwater continues to erode the topsoil. And so keeping in mind on that, the question, are we as close to the street as we can possibly be to avoid that circumstance and minimize encroachment? That was a question I had.
We'll say that, and I'm not an expert in this, when we were working with Land Tech, Chase, where the buffers are for Kings Mill, and don't hold me to this guidelines, but just from the plan, you have to have 15 foot from one property, or a total of 40 feet away from the property. But it has to be no 15 and 25. You can't do 20 and 20 unless you go and get approval within Kings Mill. So the house itself, when they placed it and we placed it, I have maybe just a couple feet on the, if you're looking from the water this way, the right setback line only has a couple feet that you could actually move the house forward. But in talks with that could potentially, as you move it up, could also make the driveway not as big to be able to turn around cars. Now, that's all in someone's own opinion based on how big your cars are or whatever. But it's actually, if you look at that corner, once again on the right-hand side, you can see it's fairly close to setback. As far as the fire pit, and I can let Trevor or any of them went out there, when they first put the fire pit, they did a rectangle. And it was further than what I even mentioned that I wanted to even go to the slope. I live on an RPA now on the Nye River, which is the Mattaponi, so I'm somewhat familiar with the Chesapeake Bay Board, not as in-depth as y'all are. But I did move it back a little bit and did a circular, but I also want to keep some distance, not that it's your concern, of not keeping too close to the porch just for any embers. It's not like I'm having a major fire pit, but just from a safety concern as well. So we did pull it back some and felt it was within the means of hopefully the scope of any questions that you might have.
Thank you.
Any other questions for the applicant? Thank you. Would
We
anyone
drove
else
2
like,
hours for this.
anybody else like to
That
speak?
was pretty cool.
Anybody else like to speak on this? At this time, I'll close the public hearing. Discussion from the board.
Mr. Chairman, it looks to me as though he's done what he can to minimize the encroachment into the RPA, and I appreciate the fact that the fire pit is pulled back within the limits of disturbance, and obviously there needs to be some safe distance from the structure to be able to combust without burning down the house, so I think a reasonable approach.
Okay. Anybody else? All right. Would someone like to make a motion?
Make a motion to adopt the resolution to grant the exception for Chesapeake Bay Board case CBPA 21 Tech 0169221 Bircher Court.
Okay, we have a motion to grant the exception. Can we have a roll call?
Yes, motion is to adopt. Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Waltrip?
Yes.
Mr. Apperson?
Yes.
Mr. Dunn?
Yes.
Mr. Gussman?
Yes. Okay. Good luck with it.
Thanks for coming down.
That concludes our public hearings. Next item is the calendar. Same calendar. I make a motion to approve the calendar. Can we have a roll call?
Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Waltrip? Mr. Apperson?
Yes.
Mr. Dunn?
Yes.
Mr. Gussman?
Yes. Okay, the calendar's approved. We're not changing the time. It's already established. Election of officers.
You care to continue on as chair, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, I do.
Okay.
Mr. Apperson, I believe you're vice chair. Would you like to continue as vice chair?
I can see I've made a memorable impact in
Sorry.
in my position as vice chair, so I'll gladly accept
Okay.
the nomination.
And Mr. Long, you're tapped, I guess, for secretary.
Certainly, thank you.
Okay, we have nominations for officers. Could we have, I make a motion to elect that slate of officers. Could we have a roll call?
Mr. Roadley?
Yes.
Mr. Waltrip? Mr. Apperson?
Yes.
Mr. Dunn?
Yes.
Mr. Gusman?
Yes. I don't believe there are any matters of special privilege. Can we have a motion to adjourn?
Move.
So moved. We are adjourned.